Lovecraft Country is a 2020 HBO series based on a 2016 novel of the same name. It's produced by Jordan Peele and J.J. Abrams, and it stars Jonathan Majors. And for the most part, it's a fun sci-fi romp with some Lovecraftian elements thrown in. Even though I enjoyed the series, for the most part, when it ended, I just felt like it had missed its mark. It had this great opportunity to introduce the Lovecraftian mythos to so many people, but I feel like it just didn't actually do what it set out to do in the first place. Why is that? What went wrong? Well, I feel like there are three major points that we're going to go through to explain why this show ultimately missed the mark. The first major problem Lovecraft Country has is a weak centralized narrative. While there are some great standalone episodes, the series seems to function more like an anthology series than one with a single, strong narrative throughout. The third episode, Holy Ghost, is great, but it's so detached from the events of the previous episode, I had to stop and sort of really think if this was even all taking place within the same timeline or if we had entered some sort of alternate universe. The second to last episode, Rewind 1921, is also great, but again, it functions better as a standalone sequence of events. The first two episodes, also really good, but they're better as more like a standalone film. As far as a single narrative connecting the entire series together, it's just a story about Jonathan Major's character being pursued by these cultists, so he and his family have to battle against them in order to keep them from killing him and the rest of them and using his magical blood to perform some sort of power-granting ritual. That's it. It comes down to a conflict between Jonathan Majors and a small handful of these cultists, and he needs to use magic to fight against them, and they're using magic against him, and they are sort of powerful, but really it's a simple story, and yet it seems very complicated, but it's not. It moves very quickly and has a lot of twists and turns, but ultimately not a whole lot happens. These cultists want what they want, and he's either going to give it to them or find a way to stop them. And that's it. The story just kind of drags on for 10 episodes when really not all that much of consequence has really happened as far as resolving the main conflict. Great as an anthology series, but as a single narrative, Lovecraft Country is relatively weak. Now, before we get into the second main problem that Lovecraft Country has, let me start by saying I am a Latino, I am a person of color, I have experienced racism throughout my life. Racism is a serious problem in the United States of America. Now, with that being said, I have to say that the social justice messaging in Lovecraft Country ultimately doesn't really add to the overall story. And in fact, I feel like it kind of gets in the way. Here's what I'm saying. I think having a message can absolutely work to your advantage in film. The movie Trial by Fire, even Black Panther, I think was made so much better by having these messages in there because they tied into the central storyline. They didn't detract from the story or stop the story to turn to the camera and bring up some historical point or make a political message. No, the messages themselves were baked into the narrative of the film. It enhanced the film. But with an entire TV series, even though this is only 10 episodes, it can be hard to maintain that connection, to make your social justice message fit with the broader narrative that you're trying to convey to the audience. And that's ultimately what happens here with Lovecraft Country. It winds up being a story about two basically disconnected things. The struggles of this family to deal with racism in the 1950s, as well as this battle against cultists. Rarely do the two actually mix and work together in any meaningful way. There is one major exception, however. Being African Americans, they naturally feel like outsiders in rural 1950s America. That actually amplifies the anxiety that the story is trying to give you, and in a very Lovecraftian way. Think of the story The Shadow of Innsmouth, when our protagonist arrived in Innsmouth, started investigating things, and the townsfolk were very suspicious of him since he was an outsider. Now here in this story, our protagonists are ostracized both for being African Americans and for being outsiders. So in that instance, the social justice narrative actually enhances the overall story. But unfortunately, this is the exception, not the norm, with most of the story. It just seems like they tacked this issue on to try and make it more topical with what's happening now with the very important Black Lives Matter movement. Unfortunately, it doesn't really add to the story. It just winds up telling kind of a second parallel story. At least in this instance, it seems like these social justice issues and Lovecraft's actual stories just don't really mix that well. Now, this third and final point has been saved for last for a reason, because it is a bit of a fanboy argument. And I sound like one of those people who've read the book and then a movie comes out and you're like, oh, it wasn't a faithful enough adaptation, or I didn't enjoy it because it didn't get every detail about these characters right. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is Lovecraft Country is not Lovecraftian enough at all. And look, I saved this point for last because I know a lot of people just want to see a fun TV show. They don't care if it honors Lovecraft's stories or his themes or any of that. Irrelevant. I get it. But the problem is you're using Lovecraft's name in your title to sell this series. So I just can't give you a pass. You have to at least honor the idea of the Lovecraftian mythos and Lovecraft's work in some way. And this series simply does not. The central theme with Lovecraft's work is cosmic horror. It's a fear of the unknown, to be even more general. Basically, characters in these stories tend to go up against some sort of force that is beyond their control. And as they find out more about what they're going up against, their dread and their isolation only amplifies because they feel like they're going up against something that's so far beyond them that they can barely even grasp it. And as they start to grasp it, it scares them, and it scares the readers as well. This story is not scary in the least bit, which is fine. It doesn't need to be. But it also doesn't even touch on any of the rich mythos that we have. Yes, it goes into a little bit about the occult, and it uses maybe one or two monsters that are inspired by Lovecraft, but for the most part, it's just a sci-fi take with a little dash of Lovecraft here and there. And I'm sorry, when you've got his name in the title, I cannot give you a pass on that. This had so much going for it in the beginning, and it could have introduced an entire new audience to the idea of the Lovecraft mythos and cosmic horror, but ultimately it just didn't. Ultimately, Lovecraft Country has a relatively weak central narrative. It tries to fit in social justice issues that don't really work with the overall story, and it's not Lovecraftian enough. And really, that's why Lovecraft Country misses the mark.